The first time I heard my husband planning a murder, it was a Thursday afternoon in late March, and I was standing in the hallway outside his home office with a cup of coffee in my hand and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples, in my wrists, in the base of my throat where my pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Daniel always closed his office door when he was working, a habit he had developed during the pandemic and never broken. He said it helped him focus, helped him separate his work life from his home life, helped him maintain the boundaries that were essential to his productivity and his sanity. I had always respected that boundary without question, had never once interrupted him during his work hours unless it was an absolute emergency. But this time, as I walked past the door on my way to the kitchen to refill my coffee, I heard his voice, low and intense, speaking words that made my blood run cold and my entire body freeze in place as if I had been turned to stone. "We need to make sure there are no traces left behind," he was saying, his voice pitched low, the way someone speaks when they are discussing something they don't want anyone else to hear. "No evidence. Nothing that could connect us to the scene. If we do this right, no one will ever find the body. That's the most important thing. Without a body, there's no case. Without a case, there's no investigation. We need to be absolutely certain that the disposal is complete and irreversible." I stood there, frozen, the coffee cup trembling in my hand, a few drops of the hot liquid spilling over the rim and scalding my fingers. I barely felt the pain. My entire consciousness was focused on the words coming through that gap in the door, words that were rearranging everything I thought I knew about my husband and my marriage and my life. The body. No one will ever find the body. My husband, the man I had been married to for 11 years, the father of my 2 children, the man who cried at sad movies and brought me soup when I was sick and told me he loved me every single night before we went to sleep, was talking about disposing of a body. Not just talking about it, planning it, discussing the logistics, the evidence, the alibis, speaking with the cold, calculated precision of someone who had given the matter a great deal of thought. "We'll need to establish an alibi," Daniel continued, his voice still low, still intense, still utterly terrifying in its matter-of-fact calmness. "Something solid. Something that puts us far away from the location when it happens. I've been thinking about the timing, and I think we should do it on a night when there's something big happening in town. A concert, a game, something that will draw attention and create confusion. Something that will give people something else to think about. That way, even if someone does notice something unusual, they'll be too distracted to pay attention. And we need to make sure our phones are accounted for. Location data can be a killer, literally. We need to leave our phones at home, or better yet, leave them somewhere that establishes our presence far from the scene." I pressed my free hand against the wall to steady myself, my legs suddenly weak and unreliable. The hallway seemed to tilt around me, the familiar contours of my home becoming strange and threatening. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a misunderstanding, a fragment of conversation taken out of context, a scenario my overactive imagination was twisting into something it wasn't. Daniel was not a violent man. He was an accountant, for God's sake. A numbers guy. A man who spent his days poring over spreadsheets and tax returns and financial statements, who got excited about finding discrepancies in quarterly reports, who had once spent an entire weekend happily reorganizing our filing system. He had never been in a fight in his life. He didn't even like watching violent movies. When we watched action films together, he would cover his eyes during the fight scenes and make jokes about how unrealistic the special effects were. This was not the behavior of a man who planned murders, but the evidence of my own ears was impossible to ignore. I had heard what I had heard. My husband was planning something terrible, something involving a body and an alibi, and the deliberate, calculated elimination of evidence. And I had no idea what to do about it. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could, my heart racing, my mind spinning through 1,000 different scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. Should I call the police? What would I tell them? That I had overheard my husband talking about disposing of a body. They would think I was crazy. They would ask for evidence, and I had none. Just fragments of a conversation that could, theoretically, be explained away. Should I confront him directly? And if he really was planning a murder, what would he do if he knew I had discovered his secret? Would I become the next body? The next disposal? The thought sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the hallway. I retreated to the kitchen and sat down at the table, the coffee cup forgotten in front of me. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to clasp them together in my lap to keep them still. The kitchen was bright and cheerful, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and illuminating the yellow walls, and the potted herbs on the windowsill, and the children's artwork pinned to the refrigerator with colorful magnets. It was the kitchen of a normal family, a happy family, a family that had no connection to murder and conspiracy and the disposal of bodies. And yet, just down the hall, my husband was on the phone with someone, planning something that sounded like it belonged in a crime drama, not in our quiet suburban life. I tried to think rationally, to push past the fear and the confusion and consider the situation logically. Daniel had been acting strangely for the past few weeks. At first, the changes had been subtle, easy to dismiss. He had been more distracted than usual, his mind somewhere else even when his body was present. He would stare off into space during dinner, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, his eyes unfocused. When I asked him what he was thinking about, he would startle, as if he had forgotten I was there, and then offer a vague excuse about work or stress or not sleeping well. I had accepted these excuses because they were plausible and because I had no reason not to accept them. Daniel had always been a bit of a worrier, a man who carried the weight of his responsibilities heavily. It was one of the things I loved about him. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, I realized that the distraction I had attributed to work stress might have had a much darker source. He had also been spending more and more time in his office with the door closed. This was not entirely unusual. He often worked from home and needed quiet to focus. But the frequency and duration of his office sessions had increased dramatically in recent weeks. He would disappear into his office right after dinner and not emerge until I was already in bed, the light creeping under the door and the murmur of his voice on phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear. When I asked him about the calls, he said they were work-related, late-night conferences with clients in different time zones. I had accepted that explanation too, because it made sense and because I wanted it to make sense. Now I wondered if those calls had been to the same person he was talking to now, the accomplice, the partner in whatever terrible thing he was planning. And then there were the errands. Strange errands at strange times, trips to places he couldn't or wouldn't explain. He had started leaving the house in the evenings, telling me he needed to pick up something from the office or meet a client for a quick drink. But his office was only 20 minutes away, and he would be gone for hours. When I asked him where he had been, he would offer vague, unconvincing answers, and then change the subject to something else. I had noticed these things. I had registered them as unusual, but I had been too busy, too distracted by my own work and my own responsibilities to put the pieces together. And I had been too trusting, too willing to believe that my husband, the man I loved, would never keep secrets from me. Now, sitting in my kitchen with the echo of his words still ringing in my ears, I realized that my trust had been misplaced. The man I had married was not the man I thought he was. He was someone else entirely, someone capable of things I could barely imagine. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of my normal routine while my mind raced through increasingly terrifying possibilities. Who was the intended victim? Was it someone I knew? Someone Daniel knew? A business rival, perhaps, someone who had wronged him in a way that had pushed him over the edge? Or was it a stranger, someone whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time? And who was the accomplice? Daniel had been talking to someone on the phone, someone he trusted enough to plan a murder with. Who could that possibly be? His brother? A friend? Someone I had never met? Someone from a part of his life he had kept hidden from me? That evening, I watched Daniel across the dinner table, searching his face for any sign of the monster I had overheard. The children were with us, our daughter Sophie chattering about her day at school, and our son Michael pushing his vegetables around his plate with the single-minded determination of an 8-year-old who had decided he didn't like broccoli. It was a normal family dinner, the kind we had shared 1,000 times before. And Daniel was the same as always. Tired, perhaps, and a little distracted, but essentially the same. He asked Sophie about her math test. He teased Michael about the broccoli. He smiled at me across the table, that familiar, affectionate smile that had always made me feel safe and loved. He was the same Daniel I had always known, the same kind and gentle and utterly ordinary man I had married. And yet, just a few hours earlier, I had heard him calmly discussing the disposal of a body. The disconnect was so profound that I began to doubt my own sanity. Maybe I had misheard. Maybe the conversation had been about something else entirely. Maybe he had been talking about a movie script, or a book he was reading, or a hypothetical scenario that had nothing to do with reality. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation that I was too frightened and too suspicious to see. I clung to that hope like a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood, even as the evidence continued to mount against it. Because the alternative, the truth, was too terrible to accept. If my husband really was planning a murder, then everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. And I wasn't ready to face that. The next few days were the longest of my life. I became a spy in my own home, watching Daniel's every move, listening to his every conversation, searching for clues that would either confirm or dispel my fears. I checked his phone when he was in the shower, scrolling through his messages and call logs with trembling fingers, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he would hear it from the bathroom. But there was nothing suspicious. Just work emails and texts from friends and the usual detritus of modern life. There were no messages to mysterious accomplices, no references to bodies or alibis or evidence. Either he was very good at covering his tracks, deleting messages as soon as he sent them, or he was using a different phone that I didn't know about. The second possibility frightened me even more than the first. If he had a secret phone, a burner phone, the kind of phone that criminals used in movies and television shows, then his planning was even more sophisticated and more deliberate than I had imagined. I searched his office when he was out of the house, going through his desk drawers and his filing cabinets and the boxes of papers he kept in the closet. I found nothing incriminating, just the usual detritus of an accountant's life. Tax returns and financial statements, and the accumulated paperwork of a decade of responsible adulthood. The search should have reassured me, but it didn't. It just made me more suspicious. He was hiding something. I knew he was hiding something. And if the evidence wasn't in his office, it was somewhere else. Somewhere I hadn't looked. I followed him one afternoon when he left the house unexpectedly, telling me he had to run an errand and would be back in an hour. I stayed several cars behind him, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I had never followed anyone before in my life. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was terrified that he would glance in his rearview mirror and recognize my car and realize that his wife was tailing him. But he didn't. He drove with the certainty of someone who had made this trip many times before, taking the highway east out of the city and then exiting onto a secondary road that wound through an industrial area I had never visited. The area was bleak and anonymous, filled with warehouses and shipping containers and the kind of deserted, gray streets where terrible things could happen without anyone noticing. He parked his car in front of a nondescript building with a faded sign I couldn't read from my hiding spot. He got out and went inside, and I waited, and waited, and waited. Nearly an hour passed, during which my imagination conjured up every possible horror. I pictured him inside that building, doing something unspeakable. I pictured him emerging with blood on his hands, with a body wrapped in plastic, with tools designed for dismemberment. I pictured the police arriving, the investigation, the arrest, the trial, the years of prison that would follow. I pictured myself, a widow in all but name, trying to explain to our children what their father had done. But when he finally emerged, he was alone. He was carrying a small package, nothing more. He got back in his car and drove home, and I followed, none the wiser. The package turned out to be a set of specialized woodworking tools that he had ordered from a supplier in that industrial district. He showed them to me that evening, excited about the new shelving unit he was planning to build in the garage. He had talked about this project for weeks, had drawn up plans and measured the space and researched the best materials. I had been supportive, encouraging even. Now I looked at those tools and wondered if they had another, more sinister purpose. Had he really driven all the way to that industrial area just to pick up woodworking supplies? Or was that a cover story, an excuse to visit a location that was connected to his darker plans? My suspicion grew with each passing day, feeding on itself, spiraling into something that bordered on obsession. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating properly. I went through the motions of my life, taking care of the children and going to work and maintaining the household. But my mind was always elsewhere, always circling back to the same terrible question. What was my husband planning? And who was going to die? I started keeping a journal, writing down everything I observed. The times he left the house, the calls I overheard fragments of, the strange comments, the unexplained absences, the moments when his mask seemed to slip and I caught a glimpse of something dark beneath the surface. I told myself that I was gathering evidence, building a case that I could take to the police if necessary. But really, I was trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. I was trying to find a pattern in the chaos, a logical explanation for behavior that defied logic. The breaking point came on a Friday night, exactly 1 week after I had first overheard the conversation. Daniel told me he had to go out, that there was something he needed to take care of. He was vague about the details, which was unlike him. He kissed me on the cheek, told me he loved me, and walked out the door. And I, consumed by fear and suspicion and a desperate need to know the truth, followed him. This time, I was better prepared. I had a plan, or at least the outline of one. I had charged my phone, filled my gas tank, and steeled myself for whatever I might discover. I had also made a decision. If I saw anything tonight that confirmed my worst fears, I would go straight to the police. I would tell them everything I knew, everything I suspected. I would turn in my own husband, because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent, and someone died because of my inaction. He drove to the same industrial area I had seen him visit before, but this time he didn't stop at the nondescript building. He continued deeper into the maze of warehouses and shipping containers, finally pulling up in front of a building that looked completely abandoned. The windows were boarded up with weathered plywood. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds that had pushed through the asphalt in determined, stubborn clumps. There was a general air of neglect that suggested the place hadn't been used in years. It was the kind of building that existed on the margins of society, ignored and forgotten, the perfect location for something terrible, the perfect location for a murder. I parked my car a safe distance away, killing the headlights and the engine and sitting in the darkness with my heart hammering against my ribs. The night was cold and still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from the highway and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the distance. I watched as Daniel got out of his car and walked toward the building. He didn't look nervous. He didn't look furtive or guilty. He looked determined, focused, the way he looked when he was working on a complicated project and knew exactly what needed to be done. That calmness, that certainty, frightened me more than anything else. He was not a man who was conflicted or uncertain. He was a man with a plan. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over the emergency call button. I had promised myself that I would call the police if I saw anything that confirmed my fears. But what had I seen so far? My husband walking into an abandoned building. That wasn't a crime. That wasn't evidence of anything. I needed more. I needed to be sure. And then another car pulled up. A sedan, dark and unremarkable, the kind of car that blended into the background and was easily forgotten. A woman got out. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and a face that was lined but kind, the face of someone who had lived a hard life but had not been hardened by it. She was wearing a simple dress, the kind of dress a woman might wear to church or to a funeral, and she was carrying a small bag in one hand. She was not what I had expected. I had imagined Daniel's accomplice as someone dark and dangerous, someone with a criminal record and a menacing demeanor, someone who looked like they belonged in a crime drama. This woman looked like someone's grandmother. This woman looked like she had spent her life baking cookies and tending a garden and reading bedtime stories to her grandchildren. Daniel greeted her with a hug, a real hug, the kind of embrace that spoke of deep affection and long familiarity. They talked for a few minutes. their voices too low for me to hear from my hiding spot, and I strained to catch even a fragment of their conversation. Was he giving her instructions? Was he telling her about the plan, the alibi, the disposal of the body? Was she the one who would help him carry out whatever terrible thing he was planning? She nodded at something he said, and then she reached up and touched his face, a gesture that was maternal and tender. He covered her hand with his own, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other with an intensity that made my heart ache despite my fear. Then they walked together toward the abandoned building and disappeared inside. I waited, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was this woman? What was her connection to my husband? And what were they doing in an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere on a Friday night? The minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. I sat in the darkness, my phone clutched in my hand, my eyes fixed on the entrance of the building. My imagination conjured up a dozen different scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. In one version, they were inside, preparing the scene, setting up lights and plastic sheeting and the tools of their terrible trade. In another version, there was already a body in there, and they were dealing with it, wrapping it in plastic, carrying it out piece by piece. In yet another version, the woman was the victim, and Daniel had lured her here under false pretenses, and at any moment I would hear a scream or a gunshot or some other sound that would confirm my worst fears. But there was no scream, no gunshot, no sounds of violence of any kind. Just the silence of the night and the distant hum of traffic and the pounding of my own heart. After about half an hour, they emerged again. They were both smiling, and Daniel had his arm around the woman's shoulders in a gesture that was protective and affectionate. The woman was holding his hand, her grip tight, as if she were drawing strength from his presence. They walked together to their separate cars, and then they embraced again, a long, heartfelt embrace that spoke of years of separation and the joy of reunion. They got into their cars and drove away, disappearing into the night. I followed Daniel home, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and relief and lingering suspicion. Whatever was happening, it was not what I had feared. I had not witnessed a murder. I had not witnessed the disposal of a body. But I had witnessed something secret and significant, and I still didn't know what it was. When Daniel got home, I was waiting for him in the living room. I had decided, during the drive back, that I couldn't go on like this. The fear and the suspicion and the sleepless nights were destroying me. I had to confront him. I had to know the truth, whatever it was. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "We need to talk." He looked at me, his expression shifting from tiredness to concern as he registered the seriousness of my tone. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Are the kids okay?" "The kids are fine," I said. "They're asleep. This isn't about them. It's about you. It's about what you've been hiding from me." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Where were you tonight? And don't tell me you were running errands." "I followed you. I saw you go into that abandoned building. I saw you meet that woman. I need to know what's going on. I need to know the truth." He stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. The silence stretched between us, heavy and oppressive, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I could see him struggling with something, some internal conflict that I couldn't identify. Part of him wanted to deny it, to make up another excuse, to retreat back into the safety of his secrets. But another part of him, the part that had been carrying this burden alone for too long, was ready to let it go. "I was wondering when you were going to ask," he said finally, his voice quiet and tired. "I knew you'd been suspicious. I could see it in your eyes, the way you looked at me, the questions you weren't asking. But I couldn't figure out how to tell you. I didn't know how to even begin. I was afraid of what you would think. I was afraid it would change everything between us." "Just tell me," I said, my voice breaking on the words. "Whatever it is, just tell me. I can't handle not knowing anymore. The not knowing is worse than anything the truth could be." He sat down on the couch across from me, his body heavy with exhaustion. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who was confessing something he had been hiding for a very long time. "That woman you saw tonight," he said. Her name is Margaret. Margaret Brennan. And she's my mother. The words didn't make sense at first. They bounced off the wall of fear and suspicion I had built around myself and scattered like meaningless noise. Your mother? I repeated, the word feeling strange and foreign in my mouth. Daniel, your mother died 15 years ago. You told me she died of cancer when you were in college. I've seen the photographs. I've heard the stories. She died. You told me she died. I know, he said, and his voice was heavy with guilt and shame and the weight of years of deception. I lied to you, Claire. I've been lying to you for our entire marriage. My mother didn't die of cancer. She didn't die at all. She's been in prison for the past 23 years. And now she's about to be released, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you the truth. The world tilted around me. I gripped the arm of the couch, my fingers digging into the fabric, trying to anchor myself to something solid. Prison, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Your mother is in prison? For what? What did she do? Daniel was silent for a long moment, gathering himself. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful, the voice of someone telling a story he had rehearsed many times but had never been able to actually share. She killed my father, he said. My biological father. His name was Robert Brennan, and he was a monster. He abused her for years, physically and emotionally, and in ways that I can't even bring myself to describe. He broke her bones. He put her in the hospital more times than I can count. The police were called to our house so often that the neighbors stopped bothering to look out their windows when the squad cars arrived. It was just part of life. Part of our life. I sat in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle slowly rearranging themselves in my mind. The secret phone calls, the strange errands, the conversation about disposing of a body. It all made sense now, in a terrible, heartbreaking way. One night, Daniel continued, his voice trembling slightly. He came home drunk, angrier than I had ever seen him. He had lost his job that day, and he was looking for someone to blame. He went after my mother first, and then he came for me. I was 12 years old, and he was beating me with his fists, and I thought I was going to die. And my mother stabbed him. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and she stabbed him, over and over, until he stopped moving. She saved my life. She went to prison for saving my life. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did you keep all of this a secret? I'm your wife, Daniel. We've been married for 11 years. I would have understood. I would have supported you. I would have been there for you. Because I was ashamed, he said, and now his voice was cracking, the tears he had been holding back finally breaking through. Ashamed of my family. Ashamed of my past. Ashamed of the violence and the trauma and the ugly, horrible things that happened in that house. I wanted to start over, to build a new life, to be someone different. When I met you, I saw a chance to leave all of that behind. To pretend that my childhood had been normal, that my parents had been normal, that I was normal. I told you my mother died of cancer because that was a story people could understand, a tragedy they could sympathize with. I couldn't tell you the truth. I couldn't tell anyone the truth. So I buried it. I buried it deep, and I built a wall around it, and I pretended it had never happened. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But now she's getting out. My mother is getting out of prison, and I can't pretend anymore. She needs me. She needs a place to live, a way to support herself, a chance to rebuild her life. And I've been trying to help her, trying to make arrangements, trying to figure out how to bring her back into my life without destroying everything I've built with you and the kids. And the conversation I overheard? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The one about disposing of a body, about alibis and evidence. Daniel looked at me, his eyes red and swollen, a sad, broken smile flickering across his face. That wasn't what you thought it was, Claire. I wasn't planning a murder. I was planning a memorial service. My mother wants to give my father a proper burial. His remains have been sitting in a storage facility for 23 years. After the trial, no one claimed them. My mother couldn't. She was in prison. I was a child. I didn't have the means or the legal standing. So they just sat there for 23 years. And now my mother wants to scatter the ashes, to say goodbye, to to close that chapter of her life for good. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I was talking to the funeral director. He was helping me arrange the transportation of the remains, the permits for scattering, all the legal and logistical details. The body I was talking about was ashes, Claire, not a corpse. The alibis and the evidence. That was about making sure the memorial didn't interfere with her parole conditions. There are rules about where she can go, who she can associate with, what she can do. I was trying to navigate those rules without drawing attention to her, without drawing attention to us. I sat back on the couch, the weight of my misunderstanding crashing down on me. All the fear, all the suspicion, all the sleepless nights and secret surveillance had been based on a mistake. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. I had convinced myself that my husband was a monster, when in reality he was a son trying to help his mother find peace after a lifetime of suffering. The building you saw, Daniel continued, the abandoned building. It's owned by a nonprofit organization that helps former inmates transition back into society. They provide housing, job training, counseling. They've been helping my mother find a place to live, a job, a way to rebuild her life after 23 years behind bars. That's where I've been going. That's what all the secrecy was about. I've been preparing for her release. I've been trying to bring her home. I thought about the woman I had seen that night, the gray-haired grandmother with the kind face and the gentle eyes. She had spent 23 years in prison for defending herself and her son from a violent abuser. She had lost everything: her freedom, her family, her chance to watch her son grow up. And now she was being released, and she was trying to rebuild a life from the wreckage of the past. And my husband, the man I had suspected of unspeakable crimes, was the one helping her do it. I got up from my chair and crossed the room to where Daniel was sitting. I knelt down in front of him, taking his hands in mine, looking up into his tear-streaked face. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I doubted you. I'm so sorry I let my imagination run wild. I should have trusted you. I should have asked you directly instead of spying and suspecting and driving myself crazy with fear." He shook his head, squeezing my hands. "You don't have to apologize. I gave you every reason to be suspicious. I was secretive. I was distant. I was lying to you, even if I thought I had good reasons for doing it. You were right to be concerned. Any wife would have been. But I jumped to the worst possible conclusion," I said. "I thought you were capable of murder. I thought you were a monster. How could I think that about you, Daniel? How could I believe that about the man I love?" "Because you were scared," he said gently. "Because I scared you. Because I created a situation that was frightening and confusing and impossible to understand. I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I should have trusted you the way you've always trusted me. I'm the one who should be sorry." We held each other for a long time, sitting on the floor of our living room, tears streaming down both our faces. The fear and the suspicion and the sleepless nights melted away, replaced by something else. Relief, understanding, the quiet, steady reassurance of knowing that the person you love is not the person you feared they might be. "I want to meet her," I said finally, pulling back to look at Daniel's face. "Your mother. I want to meet her. I want to help her. I want to be part of this." Daniel looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. "Really? You would do that? After everything I've kept from you?" "She's your mother," I said simply. "She saved your life. She sacrificed her freedom for you. How could I not want to meet her? How could I not want to help her? She's family, Daniel. And family takes care of each other." He pulled me into another embrace, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Thank you," he whispered into my hair. "Thank you, Claire. I don't deserve you. I've never deserved you." "You deserve everything," I said. "You deserve love and support and a family that stands by you no matter what. And that's what you're going to get, starting now." The next weekend, Daniel took me to meet his mother. We drove to the transitional housing facility where she was staying, a modest building in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. I was nervous, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my mind running through all the things I wanted to say and all the ways this meeting could go wrong. But when I finally met Margaret Brennan, When I looked into her eyes and saw the same kindness and vulnerability that I had glimpsed that night outside the abandoned building, my nervousness melted away. She was small and quiet, with gray hair and gentle eyes and a voice that trembled slightly when she spoke. She had spent 23 years in prison, and the experience had marked her in ways that were both visible and invisible. There were lines on her face that spoke of suffering endured and survived. There was a wariness in her posture, a habit of making herself small and unobtrusive, that spoke of years spent in an environment where drawing attention to yourself could be dangerous. But there was also strength, a quiet, unbreakable strength that had kept her alive through everything she had endured. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "Daniel has told me so much about you, about your children, about your life together. I've wanted to meet you for so long, but I didn't know if you would want to meet me." "Of course I wanted to meet you," I said, taking her hand. "You're Daniel's mother, your family, and I want you to know that I don't judge you for what happened. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and your son. That's not a crime. That's courage." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for loving my son. Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of your family." In the weeks and months that followed, we helped Margaret rebuild her life. We found her a small apartment not far from our house, a cozy place with a garden where she could plant flowers and a kitchen where she could cook the recipes she had missed during her years of incarceration. We helped her get a job at a local community center, working with victims of domestic violence, using her own experience to help other women who were trapped in the same nightmare she had escaped. We introduced her to our children, who were confused at first but quickly warmed to the gentle grandmother they had never known they had. And we planned the memorial for Robert Brennan, the man whose ashes had been sitting in a storage facility for 23 years. It was held on a crisp autumn morning, at a small park overlooking a lake that Margaret and Robert had visited when they were young and in love and full of hope for the future, before the violence had started, before everything had gone wrong. Daniel and I stood beside Margaret as she opened the urn and scattered the ashes into the water, her hands steady, her eyes dry. "I forgive you," she said quietly, speaking to the man she had killed, the man who had terrorized her, the man she had once loved. "I forgive you for what you did to me. I forgive you for what you did to our son. And I hope, wherever you are now, you found the peace that you never found in life." She turned to us, a sad smile on her face. "Thank you," she said, "both of you, for believing in me, for giving me a second chance, for helping me close this chapter of my life." "We're family," Daniel said, putting his arm around her shoulders. "That's what family does." I looked at my husband, at the man I had suspected of unspeakable crimes, and I felt a wave of love and gratitude so powerful it took my breath away. He was not a monster. He was a survivor. He was a son who had carried a burden too heavy for any child to bear, and he had carried it with grace and dignity and an unshakable love for the mother who had sacrificed everything to protect him. The fear I had felt, the suspicion, the sleepless nights, all of it seemed so distant now, so absurd. I had been so certain that I knew what was happening, so convinced that the fragments of conversation I had overheard added up to something sinister. But I had been wrong, completely, catastrophically wrong. And in being wrong, I had discovered a truth that was far more complex and far more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. My husband was not planning a murder. He was not disposing of evidence or establishing alibis for a crime. He was planning a homecoming. He was arranging a memorial. He was reaching out across 23 years of silence and shame to bring his mother back into his life. And he had been doing it all alone, carrying the weight of his secret without anyone to help him. I thought about all the years I had known Daniel, all the moments we had shared, all the conversations we had had. He had never once hinted at the truth about his past. He had constructed an entirely different history for himself, a history in which his parents had died peacefully and his childhood had been unremarkable. He had done this not because he was a liar, not because he enjoyed deception, but because he was ashamed of the violence that had defined his early years. Ashamed of the mother who had been taken away in handcuffs. Ashamed of the father who had been a monster instead of a protector. He had believed, for his entire adult life, that the truth would drive people away. That if anyone knew where he came from, what he had survived, they would look at him differently. They would see the damaged child instead of the successful man. They would see the trauma instead of the triumph. And so he had hidden. He had built walls around his heart, just as I had built walls around mine during those weeks of suspicion. We were not so different, my husband and I. We had both been afraid of things that were not what they seemed. We had both let our fears shape our perceptions and drive our actions. And we had both, in the end, been wrong. The memorial service was simple and brief, but it was also beautiful in a way that surprised me. Margaret had chosen a spot overlooking a lake, a place where she and Robert had come when they were first married, before the drinking had consumed him and the violence had begun. She had told me about those early days, the way he had been charming and attentive, the way he had made her feel like the most important person in the world. He wasn't always a monster, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the water. There was a time when he was good. There was a time when I loved him. I try to remember that time, even now. I try to hold on to the good memories, even though the bad ones are so much stronger. I watched her as she spoke. This woman who had endured so much and yet still found room in her heart for compassion. She had been beaten and broken and imprisoned. She had lost her son for 23 years, had watched him grow up through letters and photographs and the occasional, precious visit. She had every right to be bitter, to be angry, to hate the world that had taken so much from her. But she wasn't. She was grateful. Grateful for her freedom. Grateful for her son. Grateful, even, for the chance to say goodbye to the man who had hurt her so badly. If you had the chance to go back, I asked her, if you could change what happened that night, would you? She was silent for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I would change a lot of things, she said finally. I would have left him sooner. I would have taken Daniel and run, found a shelter, started over somewhere far away where he couldn't find us. But if you're asking me whether I regret defending my son, the answer is no. I will never regret that. I would do it again, 1,000 times over, if it meant keeping him safe. A mother's love doesn't have limits, Claire. It doesn't have boundaries. It doesn't care about the law or the consequences or the cost. It just acts. It just protects. It just loves. I thought about my own children, about Sophie and Michael, sleeping peacefully in their beds at home. I thought about what I would do if someone threatened them, if someone tried to hurt them the way Robert Brennan had hurt his family. And I knew, with a certainty that went all the way down to my bones, that I would do exactly what Margaret had done. I would fight. I would defend. I would sacrifice everything, my freedom, my future, my very life, if it meant keeping them safe. That was what it meant to be a mother. That was what Margaret had been trying to tell me. I understand, I said quietly. I understand now. In the weeks that followed the memorial, our family began to heal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Margaret became a regular presence in our home, coming for dinner on Sundays and attending the children's school events and slowly, carefully, building relationships with the grandchildren she had never known. Sophie, who was 10 and curious about everything, asked endless questions about her grandmother's life, and Margaret answered them with patience and honesty, telling her stories that were appropriate for her age but didn't shy away from the truth. Michael, who was 8 and more interested in video games than family history, simply accepted his new grandmother with the easy, uncomplicated love of a child who hadn't yet learned to judge people by their past. And Daniel began to change too. The weight he had been carrying for so long, the burden of his secret, was finally lifted. He smiled more. He laughed more. He talked about his childhood for the first time, not the sanitized version he had created for public consumption, but the real version, the painful version, the version that included both the darkness and the light. He told me about the nights he had spent hiding in his closet, listening to his father's rage echoing through the house. He told me about the day his mother had been taken away, the way he had stood on the front porch and watched the police car disappear down the street, certain that he would never see her again. He told me about the years in foster care, the dozen different homes he had passed through, The way he had learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut, and his heart closed off from everyone around him. "I was so angry," he said one night, sitting on the back porch and looking up at the stars. "For so long, I was so angry. At my father for what he did. At my mother for leaving me. At the world for being so unfair. I carried that anger with me everywhere I went, and it poisoned everything. My relationships, my work, my ability to be happy. It wasn't until I met you that I started to let it go. You showed me that I could be loved, that I could be trusted, that I didn't have to be defined by what happened to me when I was a child." I took his hand, holding it tightly. "You're not defined by your past," I said. "You're defined by who you are now, by the choices you make every day, by the way you love your children and support your mother and treat the people around you with kindness and respect. That's who you are, Daniel. Not the scared little boy hiding in a closet. Not the angry teenager bouncing between foster homes. The man you've chosen to become." He looked at me, his eyes glistening in the starlight. "I couldn't have become that man without you," he said. "You saved me, Claire. You gave me a reason to be better. You gave me a family. You gave me a home." We sat together in the darkness, holding hands, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. The night was quiet and peaceful, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. It was a perfect moment, the kind of moment I wanted to freeze in time and hold on to forever. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the fear and the suspicion and the sleepless nights, the misunderstanding that had almost destroyed us, the truth that had set us free, and I realized, with a clarity that surprised me, that I wouldn't change any of it. The pain had brought us closer. The secrets had forced us to be honest. The fear had taught us to trust each other in ways we never had before. "I love you," I said quietly. "I love you, and I love your mother, and I love the family we're building together. Whatever happens next, whatever challenges we face, we'll face them together. No more secrets. No more lies. Just us." "Just us," Daniel repeated, squeezing my hand. "That's all I've ever wanted. That's all I've ever needed." A year has passed since that night, and our family has continued to grow and heal and change. Margaret has become an integral part of our lives, a beloved grandmother who never misses a school play or a soccer game or a birthday party. She has also become an advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at conferences and writing articles about the need for compassion and understanding in the treatment of domestic violence survivors. Her story, the story that Daniel was so afraid to share, has become a source of strength and inspiration for others who have suffered in silence. The children have adjusted beautifully to having a grandmother they never knew existed. Sophie has developed a particular bond with Margaret, spending hours at her apartment, listening to her stories and learning to cook the recipes that Margaret learned from her own mother. Michael, who is less demonstrative but no less loving, has taken to calling her Grandma M, a nickname that Margaret cherishes. She keeps a photograph of the two of them on her mantelpiece, right next to the photograph of Daniel as a child. And Daniel and I have found a new depth in our marriage, a new level of trust and intimacy that we didn't know was possible. The experience of confronting our fears, of speaking the truths we had been hiding, of choosing to love each other even when it was hard, has strengthened our bond in ways I can't fully describe. We still argue sometimes, still disagree about things, still have moments of frustration and misunderstanding. But we don't keep secrets anymore. We don't let our fears fester in the dark. We talk. We listen. We trust. The abandoned building where I first saw Margaret has been renovated, turned into a community center that provides services for families affected by incarceration. Daniel and I volunteer there on weekends, helping with fundraising and events and whatever else needs to be done. It's our way of giving back, of taking the pain of the past and transforming it into something positive. And every time I walk past Daniel's home office, every time I hear his voice on the phone or see the door slightly ajar, I remember that Thursday afternoon in late March, the day my entire world turned upside down. I remember the fear I felt, the suspicion, the desperate certainty that my husband was capable of something terrible. And I smile. Not because the memory is a happy one, but because of what it represents. A reminder that things are not always what they seem. That love can survive secrets and misunderstandings and the darkest of fears. That the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the lies we tell ourselves. My husband is not a murderer. He is a survivor. He is a son, a father, a man who carried a burden too heavy for any child to bear and emerged on the other side with his heart still intact. And I am grateful, every single day, that I gave him the chance to explain, that I didn't call the police, that I didn't run away, that I stayed long enough to learn the truth. Because the truth, in the end, was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined.